Well, welcome everyone. I'm here today to speak with Dr. Scott Kenworthy, who is a professor at Miami University of Ohio, specializing in Russian religious history. He's the author of the forthcoming book, The People's Patriarch, Tikhon Bellavin and the Orthodox Church in North America and Revolutionary Russia, which is due out in December of 2025 from Oxford University Press. And hey, we're going to have a discount code for you in the description of this episode, and you can pre-order it. Dr. Kenworthy is an expert on the life of St. Tikhon, who is a saint beloved amongst American Orthodox Christians, but who is probably relatively unknown outside of the basics written in his hagiography. So, Dr. Kenworthy, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to this.
Great, great. Me too, actually. I love St. Tikhon. So
Hmm.
I'm hoping that listeners can come away with a better sense of who St. Tikhon is as a person, which I think is possible in many ways for us because he's a modern saint, and maybe also learn about some of the lesser known aspects of his life, especially, and this is, because this is my fandom, as it were, about his time in Lithuania, which is of special interest to me. But to start off, I wanted to ask about your own interest in St. Tikhon. So, how did you end up choosing St. Tikhon as a special focus of your study?
I suppose I first learned about St. Tikhon when I was a student at St. Vladimir's,
Okay.
when, of course, he came up in the church history classes as such an important figure for American Orthodoxy, but then also navigating the church through the Russian Revolution and the communist government and things like this.
Yeah.
Um, And then while I was working on my doctoral dissertation, which became my first book about the Trinity St. Sergius Lavra and monasticism in Russia, 25 years ago, this monumental book came out, which is entitled The Следствение дела Patriarcha Tikhona, or the investigative file on Patriarch Tikhon.
Oh,
And so it's 1,000 pages of documents, primarily from the former KGB archive,
wow.
of all of the evidence they were collecting
That,
about him, the records of the interrogations,
wow.
everything,
That must
right?
have
And
felt like a gold mine.
yeah, yeah, it's just unbelievable. And around the same time, the late 1990s, they also published some books that included from the Politburo, the highest governing body of the Communist Party, all the internal memos and reports and decisions. So this is all the stuff between Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin and all this,
Wow.
specifically about Patriarch Tikhon and about the church and things like this. And I mean, the only book written about Saint Tikhon was the one by Jane Swan in the 1960s. And
Wow.
it's like such a hugely important figure for the not only, well, for the American Orthodox Church, for global Orthodoxy, for Orthodoxy and in the modern world. And there's so much that now we can know about him that was not possible before. So it was kind of obvious. It's like, how come nobody's done this before?
Right.
Yeah.
Someone's just got to sit down and read through the whole book and then
Yeah,
read through the
that
whole.
and many others, full shelves
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
them. Yeah.
Exactly. So, I mean, I could say an area that I know pretty much nothing about with regards to St. Tikhon is his early life before he became active in church work. So if someone, were to ask you, so what was he like before he, went to the seminary, before he went to the monastery?
So we know very little, almost nothing other than just the sort of basic details of his life before the seminary, before he gets to the theological academy, especially. We know that he was born in this tiny village of Klin, which is not the bigger city of Klin near Moscow, but it's a tiny village halfway between Moscow and Riga. I mean, sort of closer to the border with Belarus and Latvia today. His father was the parish priest there. It was a very poor village.
Hmm.
I've been there. I went there about 10 years ago. It's quite, and still, it's really pretty remote and isolated. And, I did find some reports in the archives from his father about what life was like there and how much of a struggle it was to basically make ends meet for the clergy and so on. Then 4 years later, when he was 4 years old, his father was transferred to his parish in the city of Toropets, which is not too far away from where Klein was, also in northwestern Russia, but a nice city with a lot of really beautiful churches, and 10,000 people or something like this. So kind of relatively prosperous town and things like that. So that's where he grew up. Beautiful lakes and things like that around there. It's still really beautiful because it's one place that didn't get destroyed during World War II, so it still kind
Hmm.
of looks today like it did then. Um, and he gives one speech to students later on when he is a rector of the seminary about what it's like growing up as a priest's son, and learning to love the liturgy and things like. He's not explicitly referring to himself. He's sort of setting it as an ideal, but I assume
Yeah.
that it's a reflection of his own experience about how your games are played in the church courtyard, and you learn to read by reading church books, and it's sort of imbibed in you, from a young age and so on. But of course, the clergy in Russia, the sons of clergy went through a whole schooling system from elementary school all the way to seminary,
Hmm.
and if they were good enough, to the academy that was all within, it was set up for specifically for clergy,
Oh,
right? So
wow.
it was kind of, yeah, they had their own schooling system,
So he
to
was
prepare.
trained to it from very early on then.
Basically, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know that, I mean, this is kind of fast forwarding a little bit, but I know that he arrives in America when he's what, in his early 30s? Is that right?
Mhm. Yeah,
And he's here for 9 years. Um, yeah, plus or minus, I guess.
yeah. About
Eh,
eight, really. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I mean, people can read what's in the hagiography, right? And I recommend people do that. But what don't we know about his time here? Like, what's kind of being left out of the standard version of his American story?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's so much like left out, but maybe just unknown because it takes a lot of work to dig in all the archives and things like
Yeah.
this. So I spent a lot of time working in the archives in St. Petersburg, where I read a lot of the reports and things like this that he sent back to the Holy Synod. And one of the most important sources was a whole regular series of letters that he wrote to Metropolitan Flavian Gorodetzky, who was kind of his mentor figure.
Okay.
And so in those letters, especially, he's very much more personal, right? You really get to see him. It's not official. These are like personal, and he
Hmm.
expresses his frustrations and his hopes and his ideas and plans and all this kind of stuff. It's really an amazing source. And I really felt like I got to know him so much better through those letters. And I think the biggest thing that I would take away from it is, I think maybe many of us are familiar with the vision that he had for the church in America, that it was going to be one structure of an American church, but then within that, you would have almost like sub-dioceses for the separate ethnic Orthodox groups,
Yeah.
the
Right.
the Arab Orthodox and Serbs and everybody else. So he had a vision of a kind of multi-ethnic orthodoxy that would be simultaneously unified, but also allow for all the national differences and wouldn't try to force them to be homogenous or anything like this, which sadly, I guess, has never really come to fruition. But I think what we understood less about was how he really developed an incredible plan for transforming the diocese and implemented a lot of that plan when he was here.
Hmm.
So when he came in 1898, in the mindset of the Russians, the diocese in North America was still primarily Alaska,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? It's still called the Diocese of the Aleutians in Alaska. But in the time already before he arrived in the 1890s is when the mass immigration starts of Arabs, of Serbs, of Ruthenians and Rusins, who especially come over as Greek Catholics and then convert to Orthodoxy through St. Alexis Thoth and others on a massive scale. And so he very quickly realizes that there has been a kind of polar shift in the diocese from Alaska to the East Coast and some
Yeah.
Midwestern cities like Cleveland and Chicago and Minneapolis and so on. And he literally, for the first 5 years he's here in North America, he has to spend half of every year traveling. And his
Wow.
travels are just amazing. You can imagine what, travel in the turn of the century was
Yeah.
like.
Now, was he
Train,
mostly like by train? Yeah.
trains, boats, horse-drawn carriages, depending on where he was going, everything.
Wow.
He has this funny sort of in one of his letters to Flavian about when he's the first Orthodox bishop who goes to Canada, and when he's way up in the north, in Alberta, and he's like, these country roads are worse than the ones in Taropets, you know?
Wow.
Yeah, so he would travel, he'd go from, of course, the sea. The bishop's residence was in San Francisco, so that it could be on the mainland, but also connected to Alaska more easily. So he would travel from San Francisco to Minneapolis, to Chicago, to Cleveland, all through Pennsylvania, New York, and then all around New York, and then south to Galveston, and then back to San Francisco, and then up to Seattle, and then take a boat to Alaska and all the islands. He made it his goal, which he accomplished, to visit every single parish in North
Wow.
America. Yeah.
Wow.
Some he would, many he would go to actually consecrate the church when it opened. We made a trip from New York to Colorado in the dead of winter just to consecrate a new church, a Serbian church that was being opened up. So, he said after 5 years he was exhausted, right? He was contemplating going back to Russia and not returning and stuff because he was just so kind of exhausted with all the work. And he does go back to Russia in 1903. But instead of deciding to stay, he hatches this plan basically with that he has to push actually pretty hard for the Holy Synod to agree to it. He threatens not to go back if they don't agree to his plan. And the plan involved, several stages that then he brings about. The first was that he needed an assistant bishop for Alaska,
Yeah.
because that way, if there was one person who could devote their energies completely to Alaska, then he could really concentrate on, the mainland, the lower 48. And then he transfers the see from San Francisco to New York, where they had already built the church there, that then becomes the cathedral. Then immediately when he returns from Russia to North America with this newly consecrated bishop for Alaska, Bishop Innokenty Pustinsky, they together consecrate Saint Raphael to the episcopate so that he can create this mission or sort of subdiocese or whatever for the Arab Orthodox Christians. He has the plan to do the same thing with Saint Sebastian for the Serbs.
Right.
Never quite works out. And then establishes the seminary so that we can have, there can be American born and trained priests rather than always relying on missionaries coming from Russia or elsewhere and things like this. Then, of course, establishes the monastery at St. Tikhon's. So all these things he accomplishes, he sort of lays the groundwork for all of them in the first 5 years. And then he goes and he spends about half the year of 1903 in Russia. And then when he comes back right at the beginning of 1904, between 1904 and spring of 1907, he does all those things, right? It's just
Amazing.
extraordinary how much he does. Yeah. And then ends just before he leaves with having the first council, right? The first Sabor. Um,
Wow. Wow.
yeah.
So what was it like for him to function in America? I mean, America is multicultural, especially with all of the immigration going on. I mean, it's massive, massive immigration, but also multi-religious. I mean, this is very different from Russia.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, he had been so his first sort of church posting in the 1890s was in a city called Holm back then, or Helm today. It's in eastern Poland,
Okay.
which was also a fairly mixed region with predominantly his population were whatever you would call them today, Ruthenians or Ukrainians or something, who were also former Greek Catholics who had
Mm,
been brought into the Orthodox Church somewhat coercively in some cases
yeah.
by in the Russian Empire, not that long, and only in 1875, so 15 years before he got there.
Oh, so that's in living memory for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there were tensions and things like that. And there was also a lot of Catholics and a lot of Jews. And so he kind of got used to having to navigate a more diverse place than your usual in the Russian Empire for sure. Which was a repeated pattern, right? Then in North America, and then of course as we'll talk about in Lithuania, it's the
Yeah,
same
yeah, yeah.
thing. Um, so, let's see, how would I put it? It's interesting that we don't see a whole lot about him interacting with American society, except for his connections with the Episcopal Church at the time, which
Sure,
were
right.
very warm and close for the most part. Um, there's some religious competition, mostly, well, over the whole conversion of Greek Catholics to Orthodoxy. There was some conflicts with the Greek Catholics, as you might imagine. And then in Alaska, there were actually missionaries in Alaska, both Catholic and Protestant, that
Hmm.
he felt he had to kind of defend his flock against. But other than that, he was pretty open. He wanted there to be development of English language in the United States for the Orthodox Church. Of course, the Hapgood book is translation of the services is published under his, sort of he finds the funding for it and everything else. He had no opposition to Orthodox children studying in American public schools. He just accepted that as the norm, as long as there was, some kind of what we would have, Sunday schools and things like that to teach them the faith,
Yeah.
privately, as it were, in the church. Um, and I guess what he saw was the biggest challenge for his flock was people maybe being tempted to assimilate into the melting pot of America and lose their traditions and their faith, which they may see as somehow too, backward or something like that. So many of his sermons, which have been translated, his sermons in America have been translated and published by St. Tikhon's Monastery Press or Seminary Press. Many of his sermons kind of repeat this refrain about keep the faith of your fathers and things like
Yeah,
this.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So are there any I don't know, particular moments like his relationship with Saint Raphael, which is fairly well known, I think, but also maybe some of the other saints here in America that are a good story that someone should walk away with?
Hmm. Let's see. I mean, there's a one of the things that's, quite extraordinary when you look at his relationship with all of them. So Saint Raphael, Saint Sebastian, Saint Alexander Khotovitsky, Saint John Kochorov, Saint Alexis Toth, is that he really puts a lot of confidence and trust in them and
Hmm.
allows them a lot of initiative. He doesn't feel like he's the one who has to have all the power, but he delegates a lot of responsibility to them and receives and supports initiatives that come from them. When there was a moment when they decided to change the name of the diocese, because it's no longer Aleutians in Alaska and this type of thing. They needed to come up with a name, official name in America for the church and stuff. He like asked the clergy what were their input and opinions and
Hmm.
things like this. There were a few moments, for example, in Chicago, where they were saving money to build the church, right? The Holy Trinity in Chicago. And the treasure disappeared with all the money they had saved.
Oh,
And this caused a huge rift in the parish, and they didn't know how to go forward. And there was a contingent of the parish that actually blamed Father John, St. John, for what happened.
wow.
And so he made a special trip out from San Francisco to Chicago just to bring the parish together to reconcile those people who are conflicted with St. John, and to restart the process of collecting the money to build the church and things
Wow.
like that.
Beautiful.
Maybe one other story was the Patriarch of Antioch wanted St. Raphael to come back
Yeah.
because they wanted to make him a bishop. And so there was believer his flock in America actually wrote St. Tikhon a petition, which I also found in the archive in St. Petersburg, where they're like, please, we don't want him to go. We need him too much. He's doing too much for us. And of course, Saint Raphael didn't want to return either because he felt like his mission was in America. And so St. Tikhon has to write this letter to the Holy Synod in Russia saying, justifying why they should keep him rather than let him go back to Antioch.
Hmm. Hmm. So I think that a lot of American Orthodox Christians who know something about St. Tikhon may have the sense that after he leaves the U.S., he goes and becomes Patriarch of Moscow. Like that's the next thing, kind of on the in the story. But of course, that's not true. There's years in between those two things. So what happens next after he leaves the United States?
So he's appointed Archbishop. He was made Archbishop while he was still in North America, Archbishop of Yaroslavl,
Okay.
kind of in the heartland of Russia. So he's there from 1907 until the end of 1913. Then he's appointed Archbishop of Vilnius or Vilna in Lithuania, where he is from 1914 to the middle of 1917. And then in the summer of 1917, he becomes the first popularly elected Archbishop of Moscow. And then, of course, in November, he becomes elected as the
Yeah.
Patriarch.
So what do we know about his years in Yaroslavl? What was he doing there?
So the sense I get from his letters and elsewhere is that this was the happiest period of his life
Hmm.
because Yaroslavl was, if you've ever seen pictures, the churches in Yaroslavl are just phenomenally beautiful. And he loved, he was somebody who loved the church. He loved the liturgy. He loved the iconography and the aesthetics and everything of church. And so he was kind of in heaven. And Yaroslav even compares
Yeah.
it to what it was like being in America, where the churches in America are so sort of barren by comparison with what
Yeah.
they are. And there was it was after the 1905 revolution in Russia, so there was some political tensions that he had to navigate. There was always sort of increasing industrialization and threats to the faith, but in general, he really felt like his clergy and his flock were staying where they should be and things like this. So it was a easier time for him in some ways, and he developed this really close relationship with the diocese, so that when he left, the way they describe it is the whole city came out to see him off to the train station,
Wow.
and the governor and the mayor of the city and the city council were so sort of sorry to see him go that they actually elected him as a honorary citizen of the city of Yaroslavl, was something kind of unprecedented for a bishop at the
Hmm.
time. So when he was leaving in a kind of farewell banquet, they had the governor of Yaroslavl spoke about how Tikhon, I quoted here, showed an extraordinary receptivity to all public initiatives and undertakings in response to the diverse needs of contemporary life. Those who approached him felt his broad Christian goodwill toward all people of all positions, ranks, and situations, and how he had devoted his energies to philanthropy and charity and education and all of these kinds of things. So yeah, he was very much beloved
Yeah.
in your.
Yeah. I know that. So what happens, right, is that in December of 1913, he and the then Archbishop of Vilnius, or Vilna as it is in the Russian Empire, they have them switch places. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah,
So yeah, which is a little weird.
it was
So
very unusual.
yeah, so he gets appointed as the Archbishop there in Lithuania. This is still part of the Russian Empire. What is the actual geographic extent of his diocese? It's not just what we now think of as the country of Lithuania, right?
Correct. Yeah. So in the Russian Empire, there were two provinces that constitute his diocese. One province was the province of Lithuania, which was the southern part of contemporary Lithuania, and the north. western part of Belarus. So a significant chunk of it was actually what's today in Belarus. And then the other province was that of Kovno, or Kaunas today,
Right.
which was sort of the northern part of what is today
Yeah,
Lithuania.
yeah. So the next month then, right, January of 1914, he arrives in Vilnius. Um, what was that like? What did he do first?
Well, there's a funny story. The first thing, of course, on arriving is you go visit the churches. He goes to the Holy Spirit Monastery and venerates the relics of the Lithuanian martyrs. And there's a was a contemporary who was keeping a diary account of these things. And when he goes to the cathedral, um, they prepare all the usual pomp you have for bishops, right, with the eagle rugs and everything like this.
Yeah,
And he just avoids the eagle rugs and goes straight to the icons to kiss the icons, which really struck this observer as something really unusual because apparently his predecessor really liked the pomp of the episcopate, whereas Saint Tikhon he was very simple. He was, kind of more approachable. He didn't put on, airs or wasn't ostentatious in any way. So that was, yeah, kind of striking moment.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, you know, how was the Orthodox Church seen in that part of the Russian Empire at the time? And how did he kind of deal with that dynamic? Because this is not heartland Russia anymore. This is now way out in the western part of the empire, where most people are not Orthodox.
Correct. Yeah. So of his diocese of this southern part, so the province of Lithuania was, as I said, a large chunk was in current day Belarus. So about 60% of it was Belarusians. So there he had a significant Orthodox population. In the north, in the Kaunas region, it was basically all Catholics. They were all
Yeah,
Lithuanian Catholics. The city of Vilna itself was the most complicated because it was 40% Jewish
right.
and 30% Catholic, Polish Catholic, and only 20% Russian Orthodox.
Yeah,
So yeah, the Russians were a minority, and many people felt like the Russians and therefore the Russian Orthodox Church was kind of an agent, you could say, of Russian imperialism there.
yeah. I
So
know that
it's
even like native ethnic Lithuanians were a minority in Vilnius at the time.
yeah, oh,
Um,
very small, almost 2% or something like this. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So he arrives in January of 1914, and then 6 months later, Europe explodes into World War One.
Yeah.
So tell me what that was like for him. Like, what effect did the war have on his ministry there?
Yeah, it was profound, of course, because Vilnius was fairly close to the front lines and a
Mm,
major transportation hub for, because of the train lines and everything for the soldiers and war material passing through, going towards the front, and then refugees and wounded soldiers returning from the front or coming
yeah,
from the front. So he immediately turns his energies and the church's energies to serving the wounded soldiers and serving the refugees. The seminary is basically they give up the whole building of the seminary to as an infirmary for wounded soldiers, and he
mm,
houses the seminarians and reestablishes the seminary in the bishop's residence. So you can imagine that was definitely a sacrifice on his part to house the whole seminary.
wow,
And yeah, so there are lots of reports about him meeting with people in the city, including Jewish and Catholic leaders, to organize this medical relief for soldiers and things like this.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, you mentioned Jewish and Catholics that are there. So I mean, what was his relationship like with the non-Orthodox and then non-Christians as well?
Yeah, it's a little hard to get at, and of course I don't read Lithuanian or Polish, so I don't know how he may have been portrayed in those sources. But from what I have been able to gather, he seemed to have had cordial relations. There were some tensions in parts of the diocese where some Orthodox felt like the Catholics were trying to proselytize among the Orthodox and things
Hmm.
like this. But especially once the war breaks out, then they really are cooperating more than competing.
Yeah.
His relationship with the Jewish community seems to have been quite positive. So every time he would go to villages, and of course there'd be, he'd be greeted with flowers and the traditional bread and salt by the Orthodox congregation, but then there would always be local Jewish delegation that would come out and greet him with the bread and salt too. And I have a quote here for you from one of these encounters in which he says, quote, "We have a different faith than you, but we are children of one heavenly Father and of one earthly Father, the Emperor." And so this sort of idea that they were striving for the same goal and as citizens of the same um, country. And he says, he ended by saying, "The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob bless you and send you peace and quiet." Yeah.
Wow. That's beautiful. Yeah, I know that. I mean, I've visited Lithuania 3 times now myself, and there are very, very few Jews left, thanks to the Nazis, pretty much. But I mean, at the time, like Vilnius was called the Jerusalem of the North. There were so many Jews there. I mean, this is where the Talmud that's now being used was compiled, and all that kind of stuff. So it was a huge, huge presence there
Yeah.
in the early 20th century. Um, Okay, so fast forwarding a little bit more, summer of 1917, the war is still going on, and he gets made Metropolitan of Moscow. And then in a few months, Patriarch of Moscow, the first one in the modern era. So tell me the circumstances surrounding that. Like, how did that all happen, and how did he respond to that? I mean, must have seemed like it must have seemed unprecedented to him because had it been like 200 or more years since there was a Patriarch of Moscow?
Yeah. And ironically enough, when he was a student in the seminary, his fellow seminarians had given him the nickname Hierarch or,
Oh,
bishop. And then when he was in the academy, they called him the Patriarch.
wow.
And as Metropolitan Antoni Hrabowicki said when he was actually made patriarch, he's like it was almost it was prophetic, even though at the time nobody could even conceive of the patriarch existing, and you were still just a student. Yeah,
Yeah.
very interesting. But yeah, the patriarchate had been established at the beginning of the 18th century by Peter the Great. So in the late Russian Empire, let's say, there a lot of social tensions and social unrest,
Yeah.
but there were also tensions between the church and the government and even the Tsar, partially over Rasputin and these kinds of
Yeah.
things. But also, there were moments when the Tsar kind of interfered into affairs of the church in a way that a lot of churchmen kind of
Yeah.
resented and
I,
felt
I
like it was
yeah, I know
an
that sometimes people have this kind of very simplistic view that, the church and the government, the czar, everything was great, holy Russia, and then boom, Bolsheviks, and it all kinds of falls apart. But that's, as you're saying, that's not what the story really was.
no. Mm-mm. And society was changing so fast in the early 20th century that the church leaders felt like they needed to take some measures to kind of revitalize church life that
Hmm.
was too tied to the state and lacked the kind of independence. And also they needed to address liturgical issues and all kinds of things, education and everything else. And so they wanted to have a church council. The sort of real push for that begins in 1905. And there was the discussion already from that point of reinstating the patriarchate, partially with the idea that that would give it more independence vis-a-vis the state. And precisely for that reason, the Tsar doesn't allow them to convene the church council.
Hmm.
So when the situation with the war and domestic situation, everything gets to the point when the monarchy finally collapses in March 1917, what happens, the communists are still way off there. The Bolsheviks are nowhere to be found. And there's an effort to establish a democratic Russia in 1917. And the first thing that your church does is make the plans to convene a church council. Sorry. Um, and the among other things, the sort of chief procurator of the church was this kind of somewhat of a radical person, and so he forced out of office the then Metropolitan of
Yeah.
Moscow, who was
And
seen as a kind of Rasputin, you know.
yeah, and I was gonna say for those who don't know, the system before the Patriarchate is restored is there's a Holy Synod governing the church, and then there's this government official, this Oberprocurator, who is sort of their minder, um,
Yeah.
almost like a lay patriarch in some ways, right? Effectively, because he speaks for the czar,
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's who that you're mentioning. I just wanted to, in case people don't know about that role.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for
Yeah.
clarifying that. And so he forces out the Metropolitan of Moscow. Um, And so they have, for the first, I mean, bishops were always appointed by the Holy Synod with the approval of the emperor, but now the emperor is gone and you have this kind of democratic ethos. So they decide to have a diocesan assembly where all of the delegates are elected from, beginning at the parish and then at the deanery level. And so the delegates are actually elected at the deanery level and come to this diocesan assembly and vote to elect
Wow.
their archbishop. I think the only time in Russian history where that happens. And they were pretty contentious, sort of debates about who should be elected and what direction the church should take. Interestingly enough, St. Tikhon wasn't even there. He was doing things in St. Petersburg at the time. So he was not like there lobbying for himself or anything. I don't even know if he knew that he was like one of the top candidates.
Wow.
But in the end, they elect him because for multiple reasons. One, they knew that how beloved he had been in every place that he had served. His association with having spent all that time in North America and sort of a democratic country, it's like, well, we want that now, right? That's good.
Yeah.
He sort of was not tainted by any of the scandals and things connected to Rasputin or anything like this. He was seen as somebody who embraced the principle of sobornus, right? This conciliarity of conciliar church administration and reform and everything. And politically, in a very politically divided time, he was somebody who both, liberals or progressives and conservatives could claim as their own, right? Quite
Huh.
extraordinary. Yeah. And was really a unifying figure in a time generally of division.
Yeah.
Um, of course, the be part mainly because of the war, but for other reasons too, the democracy sort of falters over the course of 1917, so that by the end of the year in October, November, then the sort of most hardline faction, militant faction seizes power, the Bolsheviks, right? And at that point, that's just the church council has just started to meet. It started meeting at the end of August. So they haven't made a whole lot of progress. The first item on the agenda was the restoration of the Patriarchate. And the debates were still ongoing when the Bolsheviks seized power, and it's like, okay, we pretty much know that the majority of people were in favor of restoring the Patriarchate, so let's just end the debate and have the vote to whether or not to approve it. So it was restored right after the Bolsheviks seized power, and then they moved to elections, and which may or may not be fairly well known. They decided to have elections also. So the council itself was elected from every level, from the parish to the diocese to the deanery. I mean, to the parish to the deanery to the diocese, and then to the council. There were more lay delegates than clergy, which was also totally unprecedented in
Wow.
Russian history before that. And they decided to hold elections and then have the three candidates that received the most votes they would draw the name by lot.
Wow.
Uh, and the person who received the most votes was Antoni Khrapovitsky, the one who becomes head of the church abroad later on,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
who was very prominent, very well known, serious theologian and all this sort of stuff, but also fairly polarizing, I would say. He's kind of much
Mm.
more political type of a person, which made him, well, many people support him, but then many other people not.
Yeah.
So he wins the most votes on the first round of voting, but not by a lot, right?
Mm.
And then the second person was Arseniy Stadnitsky, was Archbishop of Novgorod. And then third actually was Tikhon, um, who was not as well known. He was not a sort of somebody who wrote a lot and things like this. And because he'd spent so much of his life kind of on the fringes of things, he was not as much of a public figure as, let's say,
Yeah.
Antoni
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
something. But
So
again, once they choose his name from the lot, then everybody sort of accepts it as, again, a kind of unifying
yeah.
figure.
Yeah.
Right?
So I mean, the whole country is kind of turning upside down. What was his ministry like as patriarch during this? I mean, this could probably be five books all by itself, but I mean, what was it like for him to be the patriarch at this time?
Yeah, I mean it's incredibly complicated, and we'd need at least another hour.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But and it's half of my book,
Okay, all right.
from
So
the
that
moment he becomes
everybody
patriarch.
buy
So
the book.
yeah, it's all in there, blow by blow. From what he's doing, what he's saying, how the Bolsheviks are responding. Everything, as I've been able to uncover it. So he seems to know from right from the beginning. So when he receives word that his name was chosen, he quotes Ezekiel that it's the scroll with woe and misery written on it, right? He's like,
Wow.
this the patriarchate is not going to be about glory and authority or power or something like this. This is going to be a hard road. Um, and fairly quickly, the Bolsheviks begin to move to disestablish the church, but in
Hmm.
a very radical way, right? They pass a law of separation of church and state, but it's not like the law in the United States at all. So it stripped the church of all of its property, not just land, not just bank accounts, but literally even the church building themselves no
Wow.
longer actually belong to the church. And even beyond that, the church itself simply ceases to exist in the eyes of the law. They forbid any kind of religious education, even if it's in a private setting and things like this. So he's right from the beginning, thrown into a position where he has to defend the church from these kinds of assaults, which then only get worse as time goes on. So he is writing these quite outspokenly critical statements about the Bolsheviks,
Hmm.
although generally very targeted. They're not about the politics or Bolshevik ideology so much. They're really targeted to defending the church from its measures against the church. But
Hmm.
all the same, they categorize him as a counter-revolutionary. And he's really, especially after the Civil War, he's one independent voice that they can't silence. And he's regarded as the spiritual leader of more than half of the population and a spiritual, leader of international stature. So they can't just get rid of him as they would other enemies, internal enemies. And so they're constantly looking for ways to compromise him or to have a trial where they could, find him guilty of counter-revolution or something like this,
Yeah.
which they do finally in 1922, and there's this whole confiscation of church valuables, which he resists, and then they arrest him, and they plan for a whole year on having a show trial that was going to end in his execution. But thanks primarily to international pressure, especially British pressure, they decide not to, and they release him.
That's interesting. I didn't actually know about the international pressure
Yeah.
about all that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I know one incident that is kind of interesting to me is like when he was still Archbishop serving Lithuania, when the front basically moves to into Vilnius, he takes the relics of the three martyrs of Vilnius, Anthony, John, and Evstathius, and he takes them to into Russia, so that they're not harmed by the Germans because apparently the Germans were going around desecrating churches and so forth. And this comes up while he's patriarch. The subject of these particular relics comes up while he's patriarch, and the Bolsheviks have taken over Russia. So tell me that story. Like what's going on there? What interest? Why would the communists be interested in the relics of these martyrs?
So in the end of 1918, the Soviets embark on this campaign to expose the relics of the saints. So it was part of popular belief, let's say, that the relics of saints were usually incorrupt.
Hmm.
And so the Soviets said, well, if we can expose these as not being incorrupt, then we can demonstrate that the church has been perpetrating this fraud, which will turn the people against the clergy, but also against, it'll sort of disillusion them in their own faith, kind of thing. So they're going after the relics of all the saints, Saint Sergius and Saint Tikhon Zadonsk, and all of them. Although it didn't have the consequences that they wanted to. Most people just felt offended by the whole thing. In fact, the pilgrimage to Saint Sergius's relics increased after they
Oh.
exposed the relic. Um, so then they had to find other things, such as close the monastery and close the churches and all these things. And so when they opened the relics of the three Vilnius martyrs, they found that actually their relics were incorrupt, which
Yep.
kind of caused them to come up with these, crazy
Yeah.
explanations for.
And they
uh,
still are. I mean, you can go and see them. They still
yeah,
are.
I've also venerated them, and and then at another point, a little bit later, so in 1920, there was an abbess from a convent in Smolensk who came and venerated the relics and asked a monk, a priest monk, who was overseeing the relics, if she could have a fragment of the relics to put in an icon of the martyrs and bring it
Hmm.
back to her convent. And of course, this priest monk asks Patriarch Tikhon for his blessing to do this, and they do it, right? This is totally normal Orthodox practice.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then when she comes back to the convent with this icon with a piece of the relics, there were miracles that were reported as, for people who were praying before this icon. And so the Soviets caught wind of this and they said, there's something dirty going on here. And so they arrested both the abbess and this monk from the monastery and put them on trial and accused them of
Wow.
blackmail, if you can, uh,
Wow.
come up with more preposterous things. And then they brought in the patriarch himself to testify in the trial. And he was like, there's nothing about this that is not, sort of part of our traditional practice. There's no blackmail involved. People can choose to venerate them or not. And then there was this whole that, but in the line of questioning, they found out that the patriarch still got a fair amount of income from this one chapel on Red Square that basically everybody who went to Moscow visited and lit candles. And so it was basically his only source of income to run the whole church administration at this point. And so they asked him, how much money do you make off of this? And when he told them, it's like, oh, speculation. We'll add the charge speculation to blackmail. And so
Wow.
they finally felt like he'd been under house arrest by this point for over a year, but they had no charges. They had nothing against him. So they were like, aha, we can concoct these charges against him so we can put him on trial. In the end, they realized it was not going to stick, and so they sort of dropped it. But
Wow. Wow. And then I know that, in the 40s, the relics get brought back to Vilnius, and they've been there ever since. Um, so okay, so my last question then. I've heard, I mean, this seems to be kind of a meme floating around the internet, that the Soviets poisoned Saint Tikhon. And there are some people that call him a martyr, that they killed him for his faith. Certainly the way they've been treating him, as you've just been describing, it's completely plausible. But you told me in another conversation that there's actually no evidence that that's what happened. So what's the true story based on the evidence about the end of his life?
well, of course, it's impossible to sort of prove a negative, right? When
Yeah,
you
right.
can say it's not possible to completely rule it out that he was poisoned, but there is no evidence pointing to the fact that he was. His health had clearly, he started having serious health issues already in 1924, where he had these episodes where he would just collapse unconscious for 15 minutes and things like this. Seemed to be having both heart and liver issues. He had a very serious episode after his cell attendant, his Kalainik in Russian, was murdered, and his he just really declined after that. That
Yeah.
was the that was December 1924, and so the beginning of the year, from January up until he dies in April 1925, he's living in a clinic in a hospital, basically a private kind of hospital. And he, as a husband and wife, doctor team, the Bakunins, relatives of the famous revolutionary, who he trusted completely. After the patriarch's death, they had to flee abroad, actually.
Mm.
And so the Dr. Bakunina wrote an account of his last days, his last months, and she said definitely there was no even he was under my constant care and supervision. There was not even an opportunity for him to have been poisoned. And the reality was is that what I have found in the course of researching my book that whenever there was like a moment, there were Bolshevik leaders who were reasonable. And when the patriarch would say, what you're doing is actually violating the separation of church and state by interfering in the internal life of the church and controlling and things like that, there were some who said, yeah, actually, he's got a point. And it was always
Mm.
Lenin who pushed the hard line.
Yeah.
And then if Lenin said yes, then Trotsky would usually implement it. And so Lenin dies in January 1924. And very shortly after Lenin dies, so after they had released Saint Tikhon from his house arrest in June 1923, but the case was still open, which they were using to still pressure him to make compromises and things like that. But a couple months after Lenin dies, they close the case. And according to the Politburo documents, they just kind of ceased to show much interest in him.
Mm.
When they released him, he made this statement that he's not an enemy of the Soviet government. And after Lenin dies, there's this internal struggle between the Bolshevik leadership of who's going to come out on top. So they're more concerned with each other than they are with the patriarch at that point.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's just no evidence that they would have, the sort of the motivation to try to kill him. If they had wanted to do that, they would have done that in
Yeah.
1923.
And how old is he at this point?
He's he's only let's see, he's born in 1865. So he's only 60. He's not old.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But he had basically from the moment he becomes patriarch, he's arrested in 1918, spends several months under house arrest and interrogation. Then he's arrested again a year later at the end of 1919, effectively spends the entirety of 1920 under house arrest. And then especially when he's arrested in 1922, he's a constant interrogation and things like
Yeah.
this. So you can imagine the
It's not
toll
good.
that.
It's not good for your health by
No,
any means.
yeah.
So yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, this has been a great conversation. Dr. Kenworthy, thank you so much for joining me today and letting everyone know more about this remarkable saint of our time.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity.
Thank God. Thank God. Well, again, everyone, the book is The People's Patriarch, Tikhon Bellavin and the Orthodox Church in North America and Revolutionary Russia, which is going to be published in December by Oxford University Press. And again, we're going to have a discount code. So make sure that you pre-order this or add it to your wish list. You're not going to want to miss this. Thanks very much for joining us, everyone. This has been a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.